Team, welcome to the second part of our brief overview on what Paul, Whitehead and myself consider some of the key changes that the APM have implemented on their upgrade from BoK 6 to BoK 7. And this is specifically relevant to rather than the full body of knowledge, it's just the what's seen on the project management qualification syllabus. And it's important to point out that, of course, that this is our opinion rather than anything that the APM thinks. So it's just our view on some of the changes. So last week we covered those points that are on the table there in red. You might in grey rather. You might remember we talked about the slight change in the definition of a project. We took you through the project environment and the recent inclusion of the VUCA, the VUCA acronym there as another analysis tool for where there is significant unpredictability in the environment. Paul took you through what is a significant change to the syllabus. Now that's the life cycle changes, both changes to the project life cycle itself, the linear project life cycle, the extended project life cycle, and the inclusion of the iterative now, and the iterative together with the hybrid. Looked at the product breakdown structure and the work breakdown structure, just the different emphasis in the usage in some of the early stages of scope management. We looked at estimating and the slight subtle change in the emphasis on the parametric estimating and its position in the life cycle. What I omitted, and that was my fault there, didn't dip into the Delphi technique. So you'll see lower down item 7, we're going to cover the Delphi technique, so I didn't cover it last week. We did cover the information management, the inclusion of curation in the information management process, so that's a 6-step process now. We covered BATNA, ZOPA, LFP, MFP when we were talking negotiations, best agreed, best alternative to a negotiated agreement, zone of potential agreement, and the least favourable and most favourable positions when it comes to, as I say, negotiations. So we're going to crack on with these 4 remaining elements. The Delphi technique, as I said, that I didn't cover. A look at critical chain, which has been around for a while, but has now been included in the syllabus. And we'll be looking at resourcing in iterative projects, particularly in comparison to traditional. And then we'll finish off with some of the slight changes in the risk management steps. So Paul's going to kick off with the Delphi technique in estimating and risk.
Hello there. Yeah, estimating, Mike went through the analogous, also known as comparative or historical, the analytical, also known as bottom-up, and the parametric. We have always added into the PMQ the 3-point estimates because we like to give super value for money. And so we've always had a little divergence into that because increasingly people are coming across that and exposed to it. But they've introduced the notion of the Delphi technique. And the Delphi technique would be used where you've perhaps got a project that you've not done before, and you're needing some expert opinion on it, or perhaps where you've got a project team that's geographically distanced, where you're trying to gather an opinion on something. And so the Delphi technique, which applies to other things as well, if you're looking for an estimate, you would have a facilitator who would organize a questionnaire or interviews with a group of individuals, and they would then collate that information from the individuals into a document which is then, and so you'd be asking them for time and cost estimates, perhaps associated with options in the concept phase, perhaps associated with packages when you get into the definition phase. And having got those individual feedbacks, you then circulate that information to all of the people who've given you feedback, and they are refined. And that way you get a very, very rich source, a consensus from several people, several experts, several people with experience, to bring you to a rich solution on somewhere where you're perhaps struggling for particularly the analogous, the historical information, or the parametric where you don't have the data to feed into it. So a technique that's used there, and we'll mention it again in a short while. Okay with that, folks? Yep.
Thanks, Paul. So this critical chain then, critical chain scheduling, you will have done, as it says on the top point there, you will remember from the original syllabus that we've looked at as part of developing a schedule, critical path. Once we've got the work breakdown structure, those smaller elements of work, those activities and the network diagram and so on, you'll remember that. One of the things that we talked about when we were doing critical path in the normal sense was the fact that we would take deterministic values. We might ask somebody, how long do you think it'll take to do that? And they might say, oh, I think that'll be 5 days, knowing that they could probably get it done in 3.5 or 4 days, but they would just incorporate a little bit of buffer just in case. And that would be the technique of critical path. Now, what critical chain is doing, if you look at the bullet point lower down, the one I'm underlining there, there is a challenge within critical chain about that buffer. And people there tends to be a focus then on the finish date, and that's got an inclusion of this buffer. So what we're going to do with critical chain scheduling then is effectively chop out, right? And this can be different amounts for different organizations and different projects to suit the context. But we would effectively pull out an agreed amount of the task duration from each of those tasks, particularly on the critical path, and put it as a buffer task at the end, right? And we will, so I'll show you that, and I'll just come back to this slide. So if I go to this next slide, you can see a very elementary network diagram there, and you can see that the critical path goes across the top of that from the start milestone through task A to C and then to the end. But you can see I've put this dotted buffer thing in. So you're looking, if you just ignore the buffer to start with, you've got a critical path, start, A, C, end. And what you would do with the critical chain process, and let's take a really brutal stance in the first instance, we're going to just halve the durations of the activities, right? So I'm just going to put these in brackets. So I'm going to halve these tasks. Okay, so this is critical chain. We're just electing, doesn't have to be, but we're just to keep it simple, we're going to go for a 50% reduction in the task duration. And what we do then, that critical path still is 16, but what we do is that reduction in the duration on the critical path, so it's now 3 and 5, we put that difference, which is 8, as the buffer task, and that's what we would control. And the focus would be on the people doing the activities as best they can, rather than on the end date. Okay, so all we've done, we've reduced the durations, but we kept the critical path. So we would do a normal critical path to get us that end date. But the difference, once we've done the reduction, right, so the 50% reduction to give us the 3 and the 5, that 8 goes into the buffer task. Obviously, the non-critical path through the network will have a reduction, and you can get, once you get into it in more sophisticated methods, you can have a feed-in buffer to the main project buffer that I've just highlighted in that dotted box at the end there. So if I just go back to that slide, right, so you can see the first bullet point, it's the same principle. You've done the critical path, but what we've done is taken those deterministic values and we've halved them. So we've taken out, we've been fairly brutal there with that 50% reduction, but we've taken those down and put all of that buffer into a buffer task. So we are just going to monitor and control that buffer activity. And as I've said there, and as I've said previously, so the approach is just that there is more emphasis on those people being task-driven, right, rather than on the end date. So we just want to get the task done as best we can. Right? So it's about countering that tendency for that buffer inclusion. We're just making it a publicly visible item, and your project manager is going to be monitoring and controlling the buffer. So it's a different focus, different emphasis, but that schedule is going to need some significant monitoring, but just a different approach. So there's the network again. Another scheduling topic is which links to the iterative life cycle that Paul covered last week, is just in iterative type of projects, you don't have that same development of the Gantt chart and the resource histogram in the true sense, where you've got the resource histogram and you're doing smoothing and leveling, resource optimization. Different approach within the iterative life cycle. In the earlier phases, you will, when you're establishing the high-level vision, you're setting up an ideal resource team. And you're going to keep that team fixed, and you've got to decide relatively early what's an appropriate set of skills in that team. And you can see we're using the term time box there, right? So you're delivering within these time boxes. So these would be your sprints. Within those time boxes, you've got fixed resources and fixed time, right? So it says complete focus on delivery of a minimum viable product within those time boxes. Right? Because you might remember within those iterative projects, you're developing the scope and the quality. The requirements scope are being developed as the project delivered, which differentiates it from the typical linear project life cycle. So your time and resources, as it says there, are fixed within the time box. So a completely different approach. And as the scope is being developed, there might need to be modifications in terms of the time and cost if we're not developing the quality and the scope to the right degree. So different, certainly a different approach to resource allocation, resource management within the iterative projects. Right, so just clarifying that. So the within the iterative life cycle, in contrast to the traditional linear project life cycle, you've not gone through that developing the requirements in the same way. You're busy producing these minimum viable products in order to develop the scope incrementally. So it is a different approach, but we do fix the resources early on, and we're forecasting, right? We're trying to get a good idea on those resource needs and set it out in those measured time boxes. But as suggested on the previous slide, it can be difficult, right? If you do realize that you need a different set of resources or additional skills, right? It can be difficult getting those at short notice. So just a different set of drivers there. Within traditional, you know, there are doing things like resource smoothing and getting resource optimization in terms of reducing peaks and filling troughs. That's got its own challenges, just a different set of challenges when you're in the doing that resource allocation and optimization within an iterative life cycle. So on to the last topic of part 2, which is the new slightly modified steps in the risk management process. To you, Paul.
Yes, you will remember in the past, it was initiate, identify, assess, plan responses, implement responses. They've removed implement responses and put in place closure. Essentially, the others remain largely the same. Initiate, you're still going to produce a risk management plan. So the first question mark below initiate is risk management plan. And the second one is that it forms part of the PMP. So the risk management plan forming part of the PMP. We're still there, have got the same, we must scale it to the project, we must consider the risk appetite. Identification, nothing changed there, it's still the same standard checklist, brainstorming, considering assumptions, previous project documentation, pestle prompts, and of course, in identification, we could use the Delphi technique mentioned previously. And the output of that is the risk register. So that's nothing changed there whatsoever. Analysis, determine the probability, determine the impact, determine the PI score using a probability impact grid or risk matrix. And they've got the output there as a risk report. And so they're now saying that for each risk you will have a report. I mean, our experience there is still that that's largely recorded within the risk register to rank the risks. Nothing changed whatsoever in the response. We've still got the same responses as we always had. We're still exactly the same responses in terms of risks there. So nothing changed there at all. Absolutely, as it always was. The outcome of that one is a risk response plan. So we've now put in there a risk response plan, which is spelling out how we will respond to the risks, which I can see there that sometimes the response to risk are a bit more wordy than you can comfortably fit into the risk register. They've now introduced closure, and closure would be either the risk has occurred and it's been mitigated, either the risk has occurred and the mitigation we had in place wasn't enough, we've had to do something else, or the risk didn't occur and it has passed. But it's the notion of we must close down the risks. And they've introduced the notion there of a lessons learned is the question mark there. So they've introduced the idea now that we should learn lessons from having done risk management. And that's a little bit of a theme that's coming through, that that one of the benefits of undertaking risk management is that all of the project personnel become more aware of risk management, become more alert to looking for risks, become more confident in dealing with risks. And so it's that maturity within the organization regarding the risk management. It's not just a function that happens, it's something that everybody should be involved in. As it stands at the moment, the PRAM guide is still on the old processes, so there's a little mismatch, but we would anticipate that the PRAM guide will get changed in due course to match the new processes. So a slight change in the processes there, with the emphasis on let's learn how to do it better next time.
Thanks for that, Paul. So that concludes our moderately swift overview of the changes that we're seeing in the PMQ syllabus as a result of the BoK 6 to 7 upgrade. Any questions from our two colleagues? Mr. Spooner.
So this isn't so much a question regarding the differences between the BoK 6, BoK 7. It might be just a generic question regarding project management. But so we're talking all about this estimating for the schedule of how long things are going to take. Does that happen in your schedule management plan, or would that happen in a resource management plan, or where would that occur within your plans, within your definition phase of your document?
So don't forget, when you do the deterministic estimates, you're making some sort of assumptions on resources you can get hold of. So you're thinking, I need 2 or 3 people or whatever, because that's where your duration comes from. You know, you'll sort of say it's 10 days because I typically can have 2 or 3 people or whatever. So when you come up with that duration, you will have an idea of resourcing in mind, or a preferred resource level of allocation. And when you do the network analysis and you come up with the Gantt chart, even though we've not done any formal resource allocation at that point, you remember we tend to do it afterwards, don't we? We build the Gantt chart and then we do the resource allocation, resource assignment, and then we go into the full-on resource optimization, the smoothing options, the leveling options, etc., utilizing float, overtime, whatever we're going to choose. So within that, I think I'm answering your question here. So you're doing the deterministic view in a traditional project life cycle, linear project life cycle. So you're doing the scheduling, and then you're leading into the resource management. Have I answered your question there, Nathan, or?
That unmute button is a wonder. No, I was just wondering, just talking about the estimation of the activity lengths and where it all ties in together with your resource management. So it's schedule, then resource management afterwards. You've just got that idea in your head what resources you would ideally want to go into that position.
You can imagine we don't tend to say too much of that on a traditional course because you don't want to overly complicate the people, but the duration has to have some idea in the back of your mind how many people I would typically do. And if you're in a really dull thing, you would sort of say, assume infinite resources as well. When you're doing your network analysis, just assume you can have as many as you like. Which of course is valid in the process, but it can confuse people. Okay.
No, Ace.
Good
Thank
question.
you so much.
What did you think to the critical chain? Have you seen it before?
No, the first time I've seen it. Well, I've heard the phrase before, but I hadn't looked into what it meant. I thought it was just they'd replaced the phrase critical path or critical chain for some reason. So that was really good insight to this buffer zone or buffered period of time. So I don't know. I think I need to have a little bit further, bit of a more exploration into it, but because I'm not quite set on it yet. But it seems I don't know, there seems like there's something there potentially, because the concept of being able to finish a task earlier than what your critical path says, when that should be the minimum duration which your project should be able to be completed with, is a bit nonsense, really, isn't it, based on what the definition is?
It's a different view, because if you take a sort of dour older person's view, we could take a view that if you take a traditional scheduling approach, critical path, etc., network diagram, you might have heard me say that with that, you typically can never finish a task early because you've already built in a buffer. And if it's going well, human nature would sort of say, oh, I'll just do something else. I've got a bit of spare time on that. So you will drop off that task and wait and go and do something else, go and do some business as usual or whatever. So those tasks with using critical path method, it's often said they'll either finish on time or late, but they'll never finish early. So the overall balance is that they finish late. And that's, for my money, that's where the critical chain thinking sort of says, take the emphasis off the end date, because people will let the activity run to the end date. In the dark. It's just sort of saying, get the task done. Get the task done and let me know how it's going. Right? And you as the project manager, feed that buffer time or allocate that buffer time back to the activities, but the focus becomes on getting that task done to the right quality. So it just changes the approach.